Now, you think of Parliament accidentally honouring a Nazi is something out of a TV sitcom, but no, this actually happened. Here is the Canadian Parliament's praising SS Galicia Division volunteer Yaroslav Hunka.
We have here in the chamber today Ukrainian Canadian world veteran from the Second World War who fought the Ukrainian independence against the Russians and continues to support the troops today, even at his age of 98.
The Speaker has since resigned. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has issued a grovelling apology.
This was a mistake that has deeply embarrassed Parliament and Canada. All of us who were in this House on Friday regret deeply having stood and clapped, even though we did so unaware of the context. It was a horrendous violation of the memory of the millions of people who died in the Holocaust.
Well, you'd have to say Justin Trudeau has been embarrassing Canada ever since he's been in charge, but that's another matter. Someone who wrote about this just recently, Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens, as ever joins me on a Monday. Peter, welcome to our new home, and thank you very much for being here. This is... I mean, you described it great, really, and very well, I should say, when you said this is what happens when people don't understand history, when they have no knowledge of anything at all, but they just go, oh, look, someone from Ukraine, must be a good guy.
It is extraordinary, and it's in fact, it's part of the general state of mind that the world's got itself into over Ukraine, which is a vast oversimplification of an immensely complicated problem.
Yeah.
And that vast oversimplification is very dangerous because it makes it very hard to reach the peace which I think would benefit everybody involved, including, above all, actually, the country of Ukraine and its citizens.
Right.
Because if it's, as long as something is cast as if it's an absolute war between good, total good and total evil,
right,
then people will say, right, well, total good must fight.
Well, you described it, didn't you, as like Lord of the Rings
Yeah,
style.
it is. It's as if the Ukrainians were nice furry hobbits and the Russians were orcs.
Yeah.
Well, of course, this isn't true. One of the problems of Ukraine and one of the reasons for the development of this crisis has been that there is more than one kind of Ukrainian. Particularly in the far west of Ukraine, there's always been a very strong strand of militant nationalism,
right,
which during the early years of the Second World War became entangled with the Nazis. And there it is, and there are people in Ukraine who continue to celebrate this. And in fact, President Zelensky has personally condemned demonstrations in support of this SS division being commemorated on the streets of Kyiv. And it's not, you don't have to be some kind of anti-Ukraine fanatic to say this is a problem. The other thing about these people is they were deeply involved in the pivotal moment of what's happening in Ukraine, namely the overthrow by violence of the democratically elected President Yanukovych in 2014, which was the beginning of the avalanche which led ultimately to war. And I think that a basic understanding of that would make it a lot easier for people to grasp what's going on and to find a workable peace, because there are lots of other Ukrainians who absolutely disapprove of these Nazi nostalgists and sympathizers, wouldn't dream of wearing the SS Wolfsangel symbol which some of these people wear, or indeed of commemorating the Ukrainian nationalist Stepan Bandera, who got mixed up with the Nazis at one point. So there are lots of Ukrainians who have nothing whatever to do with this at all.
I know.
And
but what you're expecting,
we are not trying to, and including President Zelensky, and I'm not trying to condemn them or make out Ukrainians as Nazis.
But of course, what you're expecting is for people to actually read about something before they have an opinion on it, which these days is a very, very controversial view.
Well, here's a fascinating thing. The Canadian Parliament, and this is a body of divided basically between the Canadian Conservatives and the Canadian Liberal Party, and it should, if it's modelled on Westminster, it should contain large numbers of people of wide experience and knowledge. And yet none of them knew enough to say, hang on a minute, if this guy was fighting for Ukraine in 1945, what might he have been doing?
Yes.
And nobody spotted
Why
it.
might they have been fighting the Russians? But of course, it's a very...
do people even know which side the Russians were on?
Well, surely they do.
Well, you see, you think so, but again, the Second World War has become a sort of scripture.
Yeah.
It's not. It ceased to be a war. It's become a moral tale in which, again, a total good on one side, total bad on the other, and which makes it very, very hard to recognise, of course, that we would not have, I think, survived that war in Europe, although not being for Stalin being on our side.
Yeah, I mean,
Stalin was a bad guy.
He was, and many would say worse than Hitler in numbers of people that he killed indiscriminately.
Yeah,
but also, you've also got the bad good guy image being somewhat kind of confused by those people who think that Winston Churchill was a horrible man and he was in charge of a horrible organisation called the British War Machine, and they shouldn't have bombed Dresden, and they shouldn't have done all sorts of horrible things like made the Bengal famine worse, which of course he didn't do.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's these myths abroad, aren't there?
Well, there are myths and there are truths. It's complex. I am one of those, for instance, who is very much against the bombing of German civilians during the Second World War. It wasn't just Dresden, by the way. It was practically every German city, and they didn't bomb the civilians by accident while they were trying to hit munitions factories. No. They bombed them deliberately in their homes. It was a policy, and I've written at length about this, and I think it needs to be re-examined in this country. So the thing is more...
But they were also bombing us,
the right side won.
Yeah.
For goodness sake, Hitler had to be defeated, and there was no question of that. One of the reasons why we accepted the alliance with Stalin was because Hitler had to be defeated. And as Churchill said in Parliament the day Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, if Hitler invaded hell, I would at least say a few kind words in the House of Commons about the devil.
Right. It's exactly right.
You take any allies against...
And also, I mean, in a perfect world, you wouldn't want to bomb civilians, but equally, they were bombing us. Well, I know that because my mother was running into air raid shelters every night.
And very wicked it was too.
Yeah.
And a horrible thing. All those who experienced it would tell you what a horrible thing it was, and I would say not a thing we should copy. And also the argument about its military value, which is fascinating, is it seems to me to come down and says it didn't have any military value. But we can have that discussion, happy to do so, but my main purpose here is in the illusion that people have about Ukraine being some sort of perfect, saintly country is making it harder for them to understand what's going on, and also makes it much harder for people to support, which I think really badly needs public support in Western Europe and the United States, the idea that we need to get a negotiated peace. Now, if you think that this is a straightforward struggle between total good and total evil, why would you want a negotiated peace? You say, well, let's have a total victory, and a lot of people argue for that.
There are.
And if you had a total victory, the problem is, and I'm not at all sure it's attainable, but if the Russians were totally defeated, and say, for instance, Ukraine took back Crimea militarily, then there's no doubt whatever that the current Russian government would fall, in which case who would take over?
Yeah, and they'd probably come back and have another go.
You have to be very careful. Remember, this is a nuclear-armed country.
Yeah. And
we need to worry very much about who runs it.
And we'll come to that in a second, because Grant Shapps has been making some noises, which is slightly terrifying that he's even the Secretary of State for Defence.
It's always terrifying.
I mean, this is a man who went to Spain on holiday when he was Transport Secretary, didn't know that there was going to be a ban on flying backwards and forwards into Britain because of COVID, and he was stuck in Spain. I mean, that's what you need to know about him. But I was watching, interestingly, an interview with Helen Mirren over the weekend. I don't know if you saw Laura Kunsberg's show. She's playing now Golda Meir in a new movie, which looks really interesting. But the clip they used was of her having come from Ukraine, living in Ukraine when she was a little girl, and her father making them hide from the Cossacks, because the Cossacks would come of a night into sort of Jewish areas and basically slaughter Jewish people. And when you think about that context of the Ukraine history, you think there's a lot more going on here.
Well, the anti-Semitism in that part of the world, and this wasn't just what is now Ukraine, but the Russian Empire as well, was horrific, and it's now largely eclipsed by what happened in Germany after 1933. But Russia was notorious for its horrible treatment of Jews for many centuries, actually. So that's again a complicating factor in this. I'm lucky enough to have lived in and talked to many people in these areas. So I know, but the problem is almost invariably, if I try and say, look, it's more complicated than that, what immediately happens is somebody says, oh, well, you're a Russian spy. Right. And that's the end of conversation. I'm trying to make the point that what happened in the Canadian Parliament, and actually I'm not, I pity rather than I'm enraged by a lot of the behaviour of the people in that Parliament. They're the victims of a general lack of knowledge about the past, and indeed of geography, which absolutely embraces so much of our political and media classes.
Yes.
I'm sorry for them, but I'm also appalled that people who know so little should be in charge of major policy.
Yeah, I mean, that, I think, unfortunately, is a sign of our times, isn't it?
Yes.
We have, by probably no accident, the worst education system I think that we've ever had.
It's not an accident.
And people, well,
I promise
said that
you.
before.
I've written a book about that.
Yeah, no, I know you have. And you know, here we are. This is the sort of the zenith of all of that. The final sort of chapter, if you like, is these people are running stuff now, and they don't know anything. I mean, we've got two headlines that I wanted to talk to you about with Ukraine involved. Ben Wallace apparently told the Prime Minister to give another £2 billion to Ukraine. We also saw at the weekend Grant Shapps, who's now laughably the Secretary of State for Defence, suggesting that we put British troops in there. We've got Rishi Sunak ruling it out this morning in a very small piece in the Times, kind of buried away, saying that you know, he doesn't think that what Shapps said about training being brought closer to the fighting was a good idea.
I had the impression there were British troops in Ukraine. Not many, of course, but undertaking various roles. But
I think that's meant to be a secret.
No, I think it has been reported.
Yeah.
Now, but sure, I don't. I think the difficulty is that again, what does Ben Wallace, who's got this reputation as being Mr. Gruff and Mr. Military and everything else, what does he actually know about this subject? Does he think that and what is this, £2 billion? This happens to people in politics. Oh, we could spend £2 billion here. Where does those £2 billion come from, precisely? They come from the hard-earned money of taxpayers who are forced to hand them over to the government, supposedly for the national benefit. Well, if the nation is going to be spending that much money on the Ukraine war, then I think it needs to have a much, much higher quality debate on why we're involved in it in the first place, in which people who are doubtful about it get heard. And
maybe even what it is that they're going to do with the money.
Well, there is that too, and because this money goes to a country, and this also happened in Iraq on an even grander scale, a country which is notorious for corruption.
Right.
I mean, absolutely notorious, and they don't have no secret of it. There was this recent business of the recruiting, the army recruiting chiefs being sacked en masse because of the amount of corruption that was going on there. Everybody knows that in countries of this kind. Also happens in Russia, by the way, that if you give money to the military, huge amounts of it end up in other people's pockets and never reach the front line. That's normal in corrupt countries.
Right. Well, in the reconstruction of Iraq, as it's laughingly called, with companies like Halliburton going in and all sorts of, you know, American sort of, you know, rescues that were paid for by supposedly American companies. I mean, nobody really knows what happened to most of that money either.
No, some very interesting accounts my friend Patrick Coburn wrote about, just actually huge piles of dollar bills just disappearing from the green zone, and nobody really knowing what became of them. And this is money, as I say, which has been taken from people, school dinner ladies, street cleaners, out of their taxes, and funneled into who knows where. We have to be more careful with it, and we have to have a more serious debate about it if we're going to spend at that level.
Yes, and I mean, as far as the military side of it goes, there's very little talked about that. I mean, I don't remember reading, for example, in the best part of the last month or so, any accounts of what the military activity is.
You have to look very carefully.
You really do.
I loathe The Economist as a magazine. I think it's so smug and so wrong, but it still makes a serious effort to cover what's going on. And I think what comes out is that the great Ukrainian offensive, which we were told was going to change the state of affairs during the summer, it's happened. But offensive in this kind of warfare, where you're up against somebody who is mined and fortified and enfiladed with artillery, huge areas of ground, it's not easy to take ground. It's basically, we're back to 1916. It's a 1916 type warfare happening again in 2023. It doesn't change all that much. Drones and things make a difference, but they don't make it possible to break through a heavily defended area without incredibly high casualties, of which there have been many. And the Ukrainians keep quiet about this, but it is beginning to leak out. The number of young men killed, and not just killed, but disfigured and maimed, is horrible.
Yeah.
And people, these are human beings.
Of course.
And it's happening on the other side too.
Incredible.
As a result of the folly of politicians of whom they know nothing. I just don't think we should sit here and let this carry on happening without some attempt to bring it to an end.
Indeed. Now, we've only got a minute left, but I must ask you about the BBC and Radio 4 in particular. Nick
so
Robinson.
funny.
Nick Robinson has given a great reason why nobody's, or why a million people are not watching or listening to it anymore.
He says it's because they're averse to the news. They've gone off the news. No, Nick, you're wrong.
No.
You've gone off your terrible Today programme.
Yes.
The mega bore.
Yeah.
3 hours of mega boredom and
It really is
lecturing.
awful.
I used to listen to it.
Well, it was
every
required
morning.
listening, wasn't it?
No, I keep turning it off because I can't stand it.
Yeah, well, when you and I were on the same paper, The Express, I used to listen to it on my way into work. I used to put it on in the morning as soon as I woke up. It was required listening.
It was your duty.
You know, you had to listen to it. Now,
I
it's
know
a joke.
so many people in my trade and outside who just say, I can't be bothered anymore.
Yeah.
Because it's like woman's hour
Right.
without the charm.
Yeah, I think that's a very good description of it. Well, listen, charming to see you as ever, Peter. Thank you very much indeed. Peter Hitchens, of course, will be part of the Peter Hitchens Half Hour podcast coming up a little bit later on. Next.